Now, I'm not saying Africans will provide you with the leadership. Okay? That's another weird story. I'm just saying thinking with it allows you to imagine the possibilities. If we can't reverse the ongoing march that the Sahara Desert is doing, then forget about, if I live in London, Hampstead Heath, forget it. That's just something else, somebody's car park. That's complaining. If it doesn't get to the fact that each one of us who's got a mobile phone has got a piece of metal that comes from the DRC at the expense of somebody else, then God knows what. If we don't fail to recognize that our world increasingly visually represents the misery carried by women and children on their back again. Okay? And when you look at those images of people being trafficked or whatever it is from Eritrea on the back of the bus, and then they drown in the Mediterranean, and somehow they've got a baby on the shore. 9 months it takes for somebody to get pregnant and give a baby. Something took place before they left Eritrea. Something took place before they managed to swim, if they did. There is something that we used to call the Atlantic through slavery, in which people dying on the other side. This time they're dying on the Mediterranean, the same experience. This time on the back of black African women. Not me, you know. I travel first class on Concorde. But if you walk on foot to Oxford, you see different things. And that is on the rise. Okay? They are also at the same time considered criminal. Okay? I don't give a toss about how people come into this country. I'm not saying break the law. I think it's a side issue. The question is, what drives people to leave the comfort of their homes to come to this cold place? What is it? It's not a joy. Okay? Our world increasingly is becoming like that. This is a wonderful moment because this did not just come from nowhere. There's a history that produces moments like this so that this can be a respectable form of learning. They might disappear. You might just find somebody say, prevent, there was a rebel rouser in that crimes. Who is that? You know, that has always been. I'm not one of those who sort of try to encourage people to go on the rampage, much as I used to do. I really would like to be careful with your lives. Right? It matters. I do want to encourage you to think. I do want to encourage you to do the hard work of the primary sources. Much as you have your mobile phones, go and talk to your granny and ask her, what was it like to hitchhike from London? And my grandchildren asking this foreigner, the same sort of doing this. You're a nutter, you are. I said, why? I said, how could you possibly beg to go to Oxford? You know, they think that, you know. But the moments like that might give you a sense of social, historical context in which the inequalities that you're studying came from, or the journey that they've traveled. Go there, right? Then ask yourself whether what you're finding in the archive sometimes is as innocent as it looks. And if the quarrel, at that moment the joy of learning emerges. Actually, that's what the story of what used to be called women's studies began. It didn't begin in the academy. I mean, I'm wary about people who say, I'm a radical because I read Marx module at Leeds University. That's okay. But I was drawn to a certain idea. I was drawn to certain ideas because my grandmother shared this with me. And I asked her about what it was like for her, because I couldn't talk to mother. Who talks to their mother about growing up? People tend to talk to their grandmother. Right? In that kind of is make those materials around you alive to make sense of the last 50 years that have produced the present. The anti-apartheid movement, if I want to reintroduce it again, was a British social movement. So what did it achieve? It made it possible for people to have a conversation in the middle of Dundee at the market about where did the apples come from. Okay? And it generated all sorts of interesting discussions about the inequalities around the production of the apple. That is a classic. It wasn't to do with liberating South Africa at all. It just did that. So we need to claim it back as part and parcel of the history of social movements in this country. I think it's an area to think, and some people think to do, that somehow it was the basis on which the new South Africa was born. And because of that misreading, we have this kind of shock to the system that it hasn't produced the things that we thought it would do. It said nothing about land distribution.
Mike. All right.
Happy to David in full flow. Let me just talk to you about
Okay.
90% of my time, 90% of my, 3% of my time is spent talking about Zimbabwe. And the larger part of it really has nothing to do with Zimbabwe at all. I know thinkers like Michel Foucault, God knows who he is, back to front. I read all kinds of weird things that have nothing to do with Zimbabwe whatsoever. But if you click my name, George Shire, Zimbabwe comes up, and you encounter a George that I even myself don't recognize. I really say problem, except the interviews that he's done in the last fortnight or so, and the last few weeks or so. I mean, I think my grandson says, you should look at this, it's good. So, you know, he's a good
about our interviews.
Yes, he said he liked them, so I believe him, not me. but it's the thing, partly because they freed me from talking about Zimbabwe, right? But it doesn't mean Zimbabwe is ever absent from what I'm talking about. You know what I mean? It hovers around me, but actually most of the time, I'm just talking about something else. Talking about food, if I can get a chance. So, and I'm saying that sometimes the lives we live are in themselves much more educative than things as we see them, right? And the lives you live in this part of Oxford tell you a lot more, or should tell you a lot more, about how you begin to understand what... You can't really have an understanding of equality and inequalities without, for me at any rate, without that visceral hatred for inequality or injustice. It just doesn't, it's one of those things professionals do on a kind of timesheet. You know, if you go to your equal opportunity statement, yes, does it say 10 black people in the kitchen? Yes, it does. And then it's wonderful stuff. It makes you feel good at the end of the day. In the meantime, a lot more people's life expectancy out there is a terrifying story. And I don't know what... You guys are the ones who are going to live through the reign of King William. I'll be gone by then, and same age as his father. So we kind of want to race who's going to go first. So I still can't call him King William. He's still Prince Charles to me because, you know, I mean, the difference is that he spent his life living in his mother's house. He goes to try and find a work when I've retired. So that's the difference. So I just think something else there. But the point I'm trying to make there is that I think thinking futures matters a great deal. But thinking futures is impossible without thinking about the histories that have produced the present. And your case study of apartheid is key in as much as it explains contemporary societies organized around dominance through race. And because it was a society in which it was legally structured, and as I said to you earlier, we would have been shot for sitting together in this room. Okay? I'm not over dramatizing it. It was as real as I'm describing it. Okay? There are some people who became labeled political, not because they understood Marx or the Communist Manifesto, let alone Mao, never mind all the figures of the left. They just never heard of them. But most of them is because they'd known one another across the fence. Sometimes somebody would be a single parent, there was somebody's chef or cook or garden boy or whatever they called it. They brought their child to where they work, and you were 3 or 4, you start playing with the master's son who's same age, making toys on the ground. And suddenly you get the look, you know when your parents give you a side look that says, You shouldn't be doing it. You shouldn't be. Why are you doing this? And you suddenly realize your little friendships when you're age of 3 or 4 is always are stolen moments. Okay? And suddenly, and then you don't, they disappear. Okay? You then found out they were conscripted into the army and came back to shoot you on the street. Or you, in order to survive, had to leave and come back and shoot them. Do you know what I mean? That's how we lived. Okay, and it was legislated in that. It was normalized through law. So I argue that, you know, even if Shell Company reorganized its managing directors and so on, scrapped the legislative stuff, their habits of the anti-apartheid became the same. Southern Rhodesia, Zimbabwe itself, before it was something called the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, which is Britain's first attempt to try and form another dominion. It lasted 10 years, then it collapsed, right? It was administered from here. There was a department in the Foreign Office which ran my country, my neighborhood, right? Now, and it had the same habits like apartheid South Africa. At 7 o'clock in the evening, if I was seen walking around a certain parts of Harare, I was likely to get shot before somebody asked me, why are you here? Okay? It was the normalization of the... So the first white folk that I met were missionaries. Right? And you had to be baptized. My first public document I ever owned was a baptismal certificate. And if you come into school like this, it will be something run by a missionary organization. And to get through the front door, if you're a sinner, they're not going to let you come in through their door. But if you show them a baptismal certificate, they would. They wouldn't ask for a birth certificate. That came later because of the war, when Ian Smith wanted to know how many people are joining freedom, the liberation movement. And everybody made up when they were born. No one of my generation in Zimbabwe is as exact as it appears when they say, I was born on the 5th of March, 19, whatever it is. It doesn't. People tell you the season, or what was going on, or who was around, a different waiver, but not that kind. There was a certain class of people in retrospect who choose a day. So I don't know when my dad was born. I don't know when Robert Mugabe was born. I don't know when Nelson Mandela was born. Okay, I can tell you stories about what is happening within a certain period of time. So you know whether someone was born during the maize season. So I was born in March, in the green maize season, and if you grow maize in the savannah, south of the equator, you know that maize meal only gets green for 2 weeks in the first week of March. And immediately after that, it turns to yellow. My mother went into labor looking for some green maize by a water spring that is about 100 meters from the village where my father's family still lives. I was born there. That's that story that I know. Now, I've seen in the Path News archives when the Queen Mother went to open the exhibition, the Southern African exhibition of Cecil Rhodes' work. And my mother is in this really wonderful, really rare sketch of the photograph in my house on the wall. And there's a kind of people kind of playing a game which is called dumbbells like this. And of course I was a mother's boy and I'm clutching my mother's skirt, peering to see this stuff. And of course my mother is on a particular kind of, she worked in this primary school and so on. It's people who are allowed to go and greet the Queen Mother procession were already selected few. So there I am, and I'm high there. And this is 1953. So I know I was born before 1953. Okay. Although my public document will say something else. Okay. I couldn't have been that high and be born in 1952. Right? I couldn't have been born. I must have been born after there was a locust famine. You know, the locusts sometimes come in huge swell after the Second World War. and that took place by looking in the archives in 1948. So I was born any time between 1949 and 1952. So I've chosen randomly a year from that block. And I chose that name when I first had my first public document. And to have my first public travel document, I was already on the move. And when I was on the move, I was already, escaping from the war and the involvement in local insurgencies and so on. And to get into one of those, Barbara Castle had announced in Britain that every Southern Rhodesian who doesn't have a passport can be given one of those blue passports that the British used to give rather wonderfully, the equivalent of what is done to Hong Kong. Didn't necessarily mean you could go anywhere, but you had one. Right, okay. You have to have an address to apply for one. So these liberation camps became, for the purposes of the application, were considered a refugee camp. Right. So if you go into the archive and trace how yours truly got this document, you'll find it named in a refugee camp. Now, freedom fighters will know this was a ZANU camp. So the records of that end up become the records of the War Veterans Association. So if you go to the War Veterans Association logbook, you'll find my name that way. Right? Wonderful way of approaching the archive. Because if you think ZANU wasn't organized in the same way ZAP was, it didn't have a conventional structure. So the organization of its data was not like, who is in the army, are they in Camp Zero or not? No, it was a bit like, I suppose the nearest I can give you is, I don't know how much you understand about the IRA and Sinn Féin, but very small units in which 1, 2, 3 people, and your life depends on the 3 people that you know. And in that context, data, collection was in itself not done because you wanted to make sure that the regime you're fighting didn't know. So when people say, who was a member of the war veterans, which bit were they? Those are the administrators who were in the offices. The real struggle on the front was done internally by young people. Now, what is it that young people were getting at? They had a closer understanding of the material conditions, work. They had a closer understanding of education. They had a closer understanding of housing. They had a closer understanding just about how they lived together. They also had developed skills of how to navigate around the continent, around the region, away from the dominant surveillance system. That is what gives me the conviction that as young people, you need to make sense of your local and have, if I'm going to give you a gift at all, it's that visceral hatred of injustice in whatever form you do, in whatever place you occupy. I'm not going to sit here and say join a trade union. I'm going to say make use of the space you occupy. Now, in the classroom, it may be about sharing learning opportunities with somebody whom you sit with. There's something very joyful about sharing a learning environment with somebody else, as opposed to being this clever golf. I used to be the one who knew how to pass exams, but that was my survival. I knew if I passed the exam, I could talk to my father. My father was like meeting the headmaster. I had to stand like this, all the time. He was the last colonial I could think of. My mother was a slightly different way. My mother encouraged me to do it so I would navigate the terror of my father. It wasn't about anything else other than that. It was trying to give me the thing I began with, the politics of voice. Let me stop it.
Brilliant. Thanks, George. Yeah, nice. I'll introduce them. These two have to leave because their drama teacher is leaving today and they need to give her a gift.
Yeah,
okay.
See,
go and perform.
Thank you.
Just to introduce you to Steve, who's just arrived in the building. We'll be doing the session after lunch. We're going to start the session just to remind you at 1:45 because myself and Steve both have to leave a little before 3. So, so George, any questions? for George. Any comments? That was really good. You used that word visceral quite a lot. Give us quite a visceral understanding, I think, of apartheid as a young person. Yeah, anyone got anything immediately that springs to mind that you want to say there?
Of course, you talked about the 60s and the 70s and the counterculture kind of time that it was, but do you think that there was a specific moment in your life that there was like this driving force that encouraged you to do more in the liberation movement, or was there always this consistent, need?
I think that it's back to what I keep getting on about the effect of this visceral reaction. It doesn't go away. It's not something that you can do on a day off. It stays with you. So it's been the driving force in every single moment of what is it that keeps me energized? It's that thing, right? So of course each moment is different. One requires to understand what another old friend of mine would call new times. You need to understand history doesn't stay in the same place. Okay? You need to understand things, have a sense of how we got here. Okay? So that those two bits, your desire, yes? We don't talk very much about desire. That's kind of about desire connected to understanding the historical moment. So that's how it's worked for me. It hasn't been misery. Sometimes there is a way of talking about, resistance. There is also some joyful moments of being a fugitive. There really are. That's the story of jazz. It's not, blues is something else, but that's the story of jazz for me. That there is some time after time. That song, right? Oh,
I think so. I've got something in my head. But
wait, that song, time after time. The thing about it, you can play it from any point. You can start in the middle. It still gets you, right? That's what I'm getting at. That you keep drawn to it. You keep. There's something going on when you pick up, when you listen. When first time I ever heard of Miles Davis, I thought, I want to go to where he's coming from. Now you have to ask me, what was that? Sometimes I can give you a wonderful explanation. Ask me tomorrow, I'll come up with another. There is something finished and unfinished about it, something that keeps drawing me in. So each one of us has at one point or another something that keeps drawing you back in. And sometimes there are moments in which I think I've escaped something, only to discover I didn't succeed. I thought I'd left the world behind, only to discover it was just round the corner. Sometimes I wake up thinking, I know I left at Salisbury, only to discover it was in the Harder They Come, in Jamaica somewhere. You know what I mean? I think those kinds of, that there is no such thing as an escape of history in that way. But there is, in my view, something one needs to recognize, what sometimes we call the politics of representation. It's what it is that draws you in, and how it, sometimes it determines who you have a friendship with, or get married. What makes you feel attached in attachment theory? Yeah, comfortable with somebody is to do those hopes are ongoing. They are unfinished. A work in progress the whole time. So the visceral hatred I have for injustices is never fixed in one point. It is a range of things, and at the same time, they are the things that begin to determine the different forms of solidarities that I engender. I might be different from people in terms of their standpoint here and there, but for me, the key is that clearly you can see why I'm not a Tory, because the very idea of it is an injustice. The just very idea of it, and how it's produced, how it's circulated, the ideas behind it that sustain it, become my targets. It is very clear in that way, right? And then I start looking forms in which that can, because I know the magnanimous way in which the misery that institution continues to produce and reproduce. Okay, over and above the remarks I made about Sohela Braverman and the rest of it. That's just me being angry. I continue. I won't let it go. because it is a lived organism right in front of me. And of course, the Tory party will tell you, you shouldn't listen to that guy, he's kind of doing a party political broadcast. No, that's what I'm getting at. I'm trying to describe what an injustice means to me. And I think it is for you yourself, if that you're hooked to that idea, yes, to decide for yourself what injustice means for you. And sometimes injustice means that there is no longer a play center around the corner for kids to go to. Sometimes it means that, you don't have any equipment that enables you to study properly. Sometimes it's to do with his pay is not, conditions have gone AWOL, and he's not available to give you extra help. There are all kinds of forms in which we begin to identify different kinds of injustices. So for me, I've turned it on its head. So so that it allows me to think a lot in a longer jury than. But at the same time, trying to make distinctions, working differently, giving things a timeline and a limited life, not an ever after. Yes, so that we are able to see how things have changed. Sometimes people think to me, so is racism different now? And I don't know how to answer that question. Honestly, what scale are you using? I don't know. I can't. I just feel miserable. The last day I woke up and somebody was trying to ask me what's in your bag. I'm an old man now with a walking stick. Still people think